So on Sunday, and I'll use, so for the time, I'll just use local time in Boston, Massachusetts, so Eastern Standard Time. We received a call into the First District Command Center at 5:40, so 17:40, 5:40 p.m. We received a call, and it was a report of an overdue submersible at the site of the Titanic. So in simplest terms, when that call came into the command center, it was an overdue. And we consider an overdue vessel. There's different ways that you classify search and rescue cases and different scenarios that get you into different phases. In this case, we were in the distress phase. And an overdue vessel, in the simplest terms, means that you have confirmed departure from a location and confirmed non-departure. And that would put you in the distress phase. Now, in each of our command centers around the country, these professional watchstanders have checklists that they go through. They're often referred to as a QRC, which is a quick response card. And there are quick response cards for all sorts of scenarios, from the most basic to the most complex. And in this case, we were really working off two. There's one that exists for subsurface search and rescue, and then, of course, the overdue case that I spoke of. So our watchstanders were working through those. Of course, the call was anomalous, and it was, I talked about it being simple in the terms of an overdue, but it was complex for many, many reasons. One, you're talking about a multi-dimensional search, subsurface and surface, because at the time we were working under the understanding that the emergency procedures for Titan was that the vessel would surface, and the distance offshore, the fact that there were no readily accessible response resources on the surface. But what I would say is our watchstanders are incredible professionals, and the first thing that they did is to look for air assets. And we happen to have a Coast Guard, United States Coast Guard, C-130, on deck in St. John's. And ironically, that aircraft was on deck in St. John's because they were conducting an international ice patrol mission, which is something the Coast Guard does as a result of the sinking of the Titanic. We were able to speak to them, and the crew had the capacity to fly, so we immediately launched them to conduct a surface search. And then we started working through those checklists, and over the course of going into Sunday evening, there were a lot of things that were happening. We reached out to our higher headquarters at Coast Guard Atlantic area, and they were the main conduit to the United States Navy at Fleet Forces Command, their Battle Watch. We were talking to them. We were querying the Navy if they had any available resources. Unfortunately, they did not have any available resources that could respond in a timely manner to the area. We were obviously talking to the Canadians, who were incredible throughout this entire search. And one of the things that we found on the checklist for submersible search and rescue, and I'll tell you, in my 30 years, and I've worked thousands of search and rescue cases, this was the first time I'd ever worked a subsurface search. There's an organization under NATO called ISMERLO. You're going to get me on the acronym here. I think it's the International Submarine Escape and Rescue Liaison Office. I think those are all the words. I may have gotten them out of order. And we reached out to them, and they have a 24/7 phone number you can call, and they start going through their procedures. And as part of their procedures, they put out a broadcast, basically a global broadcast to vessels at sea that have subsurface capability. So really what we were looking for at that time is ROV capability. And the vessel Deep Energy responded. They were a deep sea pipe laying vessel, and they agreed to start heading to that location with their ROVs. Now, they had 3,000 meter ROVs on board. From the time that from the time of initial notification, I believe that Deep Energy was on scene within 34 hours. By Monday morning, we were flying Canadian aircraft, both for the surface search And at that point, we were flying P-3 aircraft with the capability to listen with sonar capability. And really, I guess an important point I want to make is from the initial call, from the time that we launched that Coast Guard C-130 out of St. John's, we flew nose to tail. So that really means when an aircraft was landing, another one was basically taking off all the way up until Thursday. We were also working with the Canadian Coast Guard to get Canadian Coast Guard cutters on scene because they were the closest. We knew that we had a Coast Guard cutter that was working off, a United States Coast Guard cutter that was working off of Greenland, but they were, the initial reports were they were 4 to 5 days away. And we were reaching out to as many partners as we could, including the New York Air National Guard, who flew several sorties for us as well. Over the course of Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we continued those air searches. Deep Energy arrived on scene on Tuesday morning, and they immediately commenced ROV operations. And again, they were limited at 3,000 meter ROVs. A point I want to make there, so one of the most basic principles in search and rescue is that you go to the last known position. And that's something that, of course, we were efforting, but we were limited in our capability. And when Deep Energy arrived on scene, they pushed one of their 3,000 meter ROVs beyond its operating capability in an effort to get to the last known position, and it failed. And they brought it back to the surface, and from that point forward, we did not push beyond the operating capability. And I think I'll get back to, we can talk about the ROV planning outside of that. It's kind of a separate string of effort. At the same time, we were working vigorously to put together a team of experts. And those team of experts ultimately formed the Unified Command. And I strongly believe that we brought in the world's best experts. We had, and I'll probably miss some groups, but we were obviously working with the U.S. Navy through Fleet Forces Command. We had ComSub, PAC and LANT, NAVC, Naval Sea Services Command, and then we also were working with Navy, so SUPSALV, which is Supervisor of Dive and Salve Operations, the United States Navy.
And Captain, I think you said ComSub?
Yeah, so Commander of Submarine Forces, both Pacific and Atlantic. We also had subject matter experts on board, so submariners from the Royal Navy. We reached out to, we're lucky to be located in Boston, Massachusetts, where we have a lot of resources. We reached out to Woods Hole, to the oceanographic, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and they sent us subject matter experts, particularly one subject matter expert who was a retired Navy captain, sub-commodore. He was in the Unified Command. And we brought this team together, frankly, because OceanGate was operating without a plan. And we brought a team together to come up with a plan to effect a search.
Captain, I just want to clarify a point on that. When you say they were operating without a plan, do you mean a backup emergency rescue plan?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And, you know, if you look at it, so essentially on Sunday afternoon from a standing start, we were handed, I think what many would think is, before this, almost an impossible task. And from 5:40 Eastern Standard Time on Sunday to 9 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, we had a 6,000 meter ROV on the ocean floor at the site of the Titanic. And I've talked quite a bit with some of the experts from SUPSALV, and they will say that they consider that as unprecedented, and can talk about some of the logistics it took to move those ROVs.
And Captain, just for the record, I want to clarify some of the dates. When you say Sunday, that would be June 18th, 2023,
Correct.
Tuesday, June 20th, 2023.
Yes.
And then that Thursday, approximately 4 days later, June 22nd, 2023.
Correct.
Captain, can you clarify why the U.S. Coast Guard has responsibility for international waters over the Titanic for search and rescue?
Absolutely. So that's a question we've received quite a bit, I think. And what I would say is, it was never a question within the community of experts that understand offshore search and rescue. The world's maritime is divided into regions with responsibility clearly defined in international law. And the area that the Titanic rests is clearly within RCC Boston, so Rescue and Coordination Center Boston's area of responsibility. So I think an important point is those predetermined search and rescue agreements are critical. And what that means is there was never a delay within the community of professional responders. When the Canadians in Halifax received the call, they knew immediately it was within Boston's responsibility, and they reached out to us. And then the other thing I would say is we work so closely with the Canadians on a day-to-day basis. We exercise plans. While we've never exercised a plan for a submersible rescue, we certainly exercise them for search and rescue, for oil spill response, and we have close working relationships, and those paid dividends during this case.
Captain, when you talk about unified command, the concept, can you give a little background on that? And was it a physical location or virtual for the unified command?
So it was both. So under the Integrated Command System, ICS, ICS exists for large scale or even moderate scale responses, and what it gives you an opportunity to come together and use a common terminology. It sets up a battle rhythm for meetings, a battle rhythm for making decisions. In this case, we knew clearly that we didn't have all the subject matter expertise, and we needed to bring as much of that to the table as we could as quickly as possible. And we had a large number. We had more people in person than virtually. However, we leveraged technology to the full extent, from Microsoft Teams holding meetings to talking to the cutters on scene, the Canadian Coast Guard cutters, and the Polar Prince via satellite comms.
And earlier, you mentioned, I believe you said you flew Canadian air assets. And I just want to make sure, for the record, that you were directing our Canadian air assets to fly. It wasn't a Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard flight, correct?
Well, we had both, right? So there were multiple sorties throughout the course of the search. United States Coast Guard C-130s flew, along with the New York Air National Guard, and then the Canadian Air Force.
Thank you. And as the SAR coordinator, you were able to direct Canadian assets?
Absolutely.
Captain, can you talk about some of the information and challenges that you had up until the point where you were able to get a visual on the wreckage itself?
Well, I mean, the case was challenging for many reasons. The distance offshore, the fact that we didn't have Canadian or Coast Guard surface assets there for a few days. The fact that we were limited initially to 3,000 meter ROVs. We were working vigorously to bring in additional capability. I mean, that's obvious, right? Because we got to the point of having a 6,000 meter ROV on scene on Thursday. I'm happy to talk to some of how that was planned.
Before we go to that, sir, I'm curious if you had communications with oceangate or the crew of the Polar Prince that were on scene at the site.
We did.